Japan is now saying it is tired of enduring disrespect from the United States and of the way America exploits its economic position. That's why Tokyo is prepared to take tough measures, using its assets in the US as a weapon. And that's not all. Japan is one of the largest investors in America, supporting over 800,000 jobs through automakers like Toyota, Honda, Nissan, and Mitsubishi. So what does Japan get in return from the Trump administration? The answer: destructive tariffs that threaten to destroy Japan's automobile market. And even that is not enough for Washington. Now the US is demanding that Japan stop selling its semiconductor equipment to China. Think it can't get worse? It does. America has gone even further, now targeting Japanese rice by restricting its export to the US. It's starting to look like the Trump administration's goal is to bring down the Japanese economy. But Japan has no intention of standing by. It has made it clear it's had enough. If Tokyo pulls its investments from the US, it's not just Wall Street that will suffer. The American government itself could face budget shortfalls. So what is really happening, and how is Japan planning to respond? Let's take a closer look. For more than 70 years, Japan and the US have been close allies. They've cooperated in trade, defense, and technology. Japan supported America's goals in the region, opened its markets to American companies, and allowed US military bases on its soil. In return, it expected a reliable partner. But in 2025, that alliance began to fracture. Many believe Washington is to blame for betraying its Asian ally. It may sound unbelievable, but the US government is now claiming that Japanese cars are a threat to national security. The Trump administration plans to impose tariffs of 25%, possibly even 30%. This is no longer just a trade dispute. It's economic pressure on one of America's closest partners. And it comes at a very difficult moment for Japan's economy and for the millions of people who depend on trade between the two nations. As expected, Japan reacted with outrage. Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba called the decision extremely disappointing and deeply regrettable, describing it as a national crisis requiring an unprecedented response. Lead trade negotiator Ryosei Akazawa stated clearly, "We have repeatedly expressed our regret over these tariffs and are demanding their reconsideration." Finance Minister Katsunobu Kato warned that these measures threaten not only Japan, but also the global economy. He said the government is seriously concerned that the tariffs could slow recovery, destabilize markets, and undermine the financial system. Bank of Japan Governor Kazuo Ueda added that growth and inflation forecasts are deteriorating, meaning Japan's economic policy must now become even more cautious. But while Japan sees the tariffs as a hostile move, Washington insists they are not about punishment, but about restoring fairness after decades of trade imbalance. Many Americans have no idea just how vital Japan is to the US economy. If Tokyo withdraws its support, the consequences could be catastrophic. Key American industries would come under threat, and some might not survive at all. So let's take a closer look at just how important Japan is to America. Auto giants like Toyota, Honda, and Nissan have been investing in the United States for decades. They haven't just shipped cars from Japan. They built factories in Texas, Kentucky, Alabama, and Mississippi. Today, these plants produce over 3 million vehicles a year, nearly all of them for the US market. In 2023, nearly half of all cars sold in the US were from Japanese brands. Toyota became the #1 automaker in the country. Just think, without Japan, nearly half of the cars on American roads wouldn't exist. And these aren't just any cars. They're high quality, reliable, and often cheaper and better than domestic options. In 2024, Toyota once again took the top spot, selling over 4.4 million vehicles. These companies don't just represent cars, they represent jobs. More than 500,000 Americans are directly or indirectly employed by Japanese automakers. Some estimates say nearly 840,000 work across factories, offices, dealerships, and parts suppliers. Altogether, over 2 million jobs in the US depend on this sector. These workers earn more than $90 billion a year and pay over $30 billion in taxes that fund schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. These aren't jobs that can easily be replaced. And now, the White House is treating these same companies as a threat. Tariffs of 25% or more will make Japanese cars more expensive, meaning fewer Americans will buy them. As a result, Japanese companies could scale back production in the US. Some factories might close, and workers could lose their jobs. That would hit not just Japan, but also the American towns that rely on these plants. This isn't how allies treat each other. It feels more like betrayal. Japan trusted the US, opened its markets, cooperated on defense, respected American policies, and now it's being treated like an economic enemy. No one in Tokyo seems to have expected such a blow. But the situation is even more complex. Japan is facing pressure from both sides. On one hand, the US is threatening its auto industry with steep tariffs. On the other, China is flooding the global market with cheap electric vehicles, cheap thanks to heavy government subsidies. Japan cannot match those prices and still remain profitable. And if US tariffs make Japanese cars even more expensive, they'll lose ground to Chinese models. So Japan is caught between two powers, one building trade barriers, the other flooding the market with subsidized goods. It's an unwinnable position unless Japan changes course. But shifting direction quickly is difficult, especially when the economy is already under strain. And there's another key front in this conflict: semiconductors. Japan makes the equipment needed to manufacture advanced chips, highly sophisticated machines that are nearly irreplaceable, and roughly half of that equipment is sold to China. The US wants to stop that. Washington is trying to slow down China's tech development, and blocking Japan's chip machinery exports is part of that plan. But Japan doesn't want to lose such a major customer, especially right now. And this is where the auto tariffs come into play. By threatening Japan's auto industry, the United States is trying to pressure Tokyo into halting exports of chip-making equipment to China. In reality, this is not about rice or auto parts, as public statements might suggest. At its core, it's about control over technology and the use of economic pressure for political ends. Recently, the US Congress sent Japan a confidential but serious letter. Unlike most diplomatic communications, it wasn't made public. It was delivered directly to the Japanese ambassador in Washington, quietly and without media attention. This shows how urgent and sensitive Washington considers the issue. US officials fear that if China continues building new chip factories, it could soon control up to half of the world's production of older generation, yet still widely used, semiconductors. These chips are essential for cars, consumer electronics, and even military hardware. In the letter, the US tried to persuade Japan that companies from Japan and other Western allies won't actually lose profits by exiting the Chinese market. On the contrary, it claimed their stock prices would rise. The message also referenced America's massive investments in its own semiconductor industry and urged its allies to follow suit. A particular point of concern was the Chinese tech giant Huawei. According to the US, Huawei is secretly building numerous new chip fabs while deliberately hiding its involvement. That, the letter argued, is a serious red flag. In essence, the US is pushing Japan to make a choice: either side with Washington and help contain China's technological rise, or risk losing American support, even if that comes at the expense of Japan's own profits. Ironically, America's tariffs are now backfiring. The government introduced them to protect American jobs, but the results have been the opposite. The tariffs are hitting not cheap Chinese imports, but cars assembled in the United States by American workers, vehicles built using parts and materials sourced through trade agreements like NAFTA and its updated version, the USMCA. Japan chose not to respond with public outrage. Instead, it took quiet but calculated action. For example, Nissan cut production of one of its key models, the Rogue, by 13,000 units at its Kyushu plant. This was no spur-of-the-moment decision. Nissan had anticipated that the model would be targeted by the new tariffs. Toyota also chose not to expand its investments in the United States, instead directing funds toward Thailand. These were not rushed reactions. They were carefully planned moves. Japan had begun preparing for this scenario back in 2018, when the first trade disputes flared up. Now it is simply putting its contingency plans into action. And this clearly shows that Japanese companies no longer see the US as a reliable base for auto manufacturing. But Japan didn't stop there. What other steps is it taking to secure its future? After Japanese automakers began scaling back their presence in the US, they moved on to the next phase, shifting the geography of production. Increasingly, investment has flowed into Southeast Asia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia, have emerged as new manufacturing hubs for Japan's auto industry. Toyota distributed its electric vehicle production across 5 countries. Mazda invested $150 million into EV plants in Thailand. But perhaps most striking was Toyota's $2 billion deal to build an EV factory in Shanghai. Not long ago, it would have been hard to imagine Japan taking such a step toward China, especially amid rising tensions with the US. But that is exactly what happened. Trust in America has eroded to the point where even China now appears to be a more dependable partner. The decline of Japanese auto manufacturing in the US won't be abrupt. The shift will unfold gradually. New vehicle models will simply stop being assigned to American plants. So the real question now is not whether this shift will continue, but how far it will go and what it will mean for America's economic future. To stay updated on global changes and understand what's coming next, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. See you in the next video.